Evidence, emails, and secret recordings that unravel a web of bribery, backdoor deals, and misuse of taxpayer money, exposing the truth behind Mayor Tiffany Henyard's rise to power. The image she had so carefully crafted as a smooth-talking, unassailable political figure began to crack. The woman who once dominated Dalton's political landscape, her face adorning billboards while skimming over questionable financials, was now exposed, frozen in place. Her face drained of color as the truth unfolded before her. The residents of Dalton, her once loyal supporters, watched in stunned disbelief as the woman they had trusted for years was revealed to be a fraud. But it didn't end there. In a fit of rage, Henyard slammed her fist on the table so hard that the chair screeched across the polished floor. Standing up, she shouted, "This is a setup." Her voice cracked with frustration, but the room wasn't buying it. The judge's gavel pounded with authority, silencing her outburst. But Henyard wasn't done. Pointing a finger at the prosecution, she screamed, "This is political." You don't want a strong woman. The irony was thick in the air, as the woman accused of bullying local officials, inflating salaries, and funneling money into mysterious projects now tried to cast herself as a victim. It was classic Henyard, playing the martyr in a desperate attempt to salvage her image in her final, futile attempt to control the narrative. She turned on her lawyers. "You were supposed to handle this," she yelled, her voice dripping with contempt. One of her attorneys shuffled through papers awkwardly, clearly embarrassed, while the other refused to meet her eyes. The cracks in her empire were glaringly evident. For the first time in her political career, Henyard had no deflections, no spin. Nothing left to control the narrative. The truth had caught up with her in a move that shocked everyone. She grabbed her designer handbag, ripped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. Gasps followed her exit, the room thick with tension. She was leaving. The once unstoppable mayor of Dalton was abandoning the fight. But the silence didn't last. The people who had been manipulated, lied to, and betrayed erupted into applause. Justice had arrived, and Henyard was running out of places to hide. The courthouse exploded into chaos as court officials slammed their desks, shouting for order, while reporters scrambled to keep up with the fleeing mayor. "Did you see her face?" one resident laughed. "I told you she was a crook," shouted another. "This is what happens when you mess with the people's money," a third voice chimed in from the crowd inside the courtroom. Henyard's inner circle sat frozen, trying to salvage what they could. Phones rang frantically as the fallout set in. No one was safe now outside. The media swarmed Henyard as she stormed down the courthouse steps. Her heels clicked furiously against the pavement, each step echoing through the tense air. The press bombarded her with questions. "Mayor Henyard, do you have a comment on the leaked recordings?" one reporter shouted. "Is it true that millions of taxpayer dollars are missing?" another pressed. "Will you resign after the day's hearing?" Henyard remained tight-lipped, her face set in a hard mask of defiance as her security team tried to push the reporters away. But the press was relentless, forming an ever-tightening circle of questions, trapping her with no escape. Just when it seemed Henyard might slip away into the safety of her car, a voice broke through the chaos. A woman stepped forward, blocking her path. It was the former treasurer of Dalton, an unexpected and dramatic twist. This was the woman who had resigned months earlier, citing suspicions of mismanagement, and accusing Henyard of unethical conduct. Her eyes burned with fire as she faced the woman who had once held so much power. "Do you think you can run from this now, Tiffany?" the former treasurer spat, her voice sharp for a brief moment. Henyard seemed caught off guard. The woman who had once controlled everything was now on the receiving end of an indictment. Not from courts, but from someone who knew her all too well. Sensing the chance for even more drama, the media turned their cameras toward the confrontation. It felt like the final act in a long, painful saga. Would Henyard try to deflect, or had the truth finally cornered her beyond escape? The people of Dalton, who had watched this drama unfold for so long, now found themselves on the edge of history. Would this be the moment they finally saw their city free from the grip of its controversial leader? Henyard stood in the middle of the media storm, and for the first time, she knew this was one fight she couldn't win. Crackling with anticipation, reporters clicked away with their cameras while murmurs rippled through the crowd. At the center of it all stood Tiffany Henyard, the so-called super mayor, once untouchable, now the personification of defiance. She had entered the courtroom with the same arrogance that had defined her entire political career. Chin held high, eyes brimming with unshakable confidence. Behind her stood a team of lawyers, likely paid with taxpayer money. But that didn't seem to faze her. Then came the bombshell. The prosecution unleashed a barrage of evidence that rocked the room. Leaked statements, emails, and recordings all revealed Henyard's involvement in bribery, backdoor deals, and the misuse of taxpayer funds. The room fell silent as the contents flashed across the courtroom's big screen. every secret, every manipulation laid bare. Henyard, once known for her smooth talking and carefully crafted public persona, froze. Her mask cracked, and she sat still, her face drained of color as the truth poured into the room like a flood. The residents of Dalton, who had once placed their trust in her, sat in stunned silence as the woman they believed in for so long was revealed for who she truly was. No longer the powerful leader they thought they knew, but a fraud exposed. Her empire of lies was beginning to unravel before their eyes, but this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning of a fit of rage. Henyard slammed her fist onto the table so forcefully that her chair screeched across the polished floor. She stood, her eyes blazing with fury, and screamed, "This is a setup." Her voice cracked with emotion, but the room remained unmoved. The judge's gavel pounded for order, but Henyard refused to back down. Pointing an accusatory finger at the prosecution, she shouted, "This is political. You don't want a strong woman." The irony in her words was thick. Here was a woman who had used her position to bully local officials, inflate salaries, and funnel money into dubious projects, now trying to cast herself as a victim. It was a classic Henyard move, playing the martyr when the walls were closing in a desperate last-ditch effort to salvage her image. Henyard turned on her lawyers. "You were supposed to handle this," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. One of her lawyers awkwardly shuffled through papers, clearly embarrassed, while the other refused to meet her eyes. The cracks in her carefully crafted empire were now impossible to ignore. The truth had finally caught up with her, and she had no answers, no spin left to offer. It was over in a shocking and dramatic move. Henyard grabbed her designer handbag, ripped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. The gasps that followed were audible. For the first time in her political career, Henyard couldn't control the narrative. She was walking away from the fight, and the public was watching. The room, once filled with tension, now buzzed with whispers. The once unstoppable mayor was fleeing, and the power she had held over Dalton for years was slipping from her grasp. Then something unexpected happened. The former treasurer of Dalton, a woman who had resigned months earlier after alleging financial mismanagement and corruption, stepped forward and blocked Henyard's path. This was the same woman who had been bullied and threatened by Henyard's administration. But now, she was determined not to let this moment slip away. She wasn't about to let Henyard walk away without facing the truth. "You can run out of court, but you can't run from the truth, Tiffany," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension for the first time that day. Henyard faltered. She froze for a brief moment, a crack in her armor. The facade that had protected her for so long was beginning to crumble. But the former treasurer wasn't done. "You silenced all of us. But guess what?" she continued, her voice growing bolder as the cameras clicked and rolled. "You can't silence the truth." The crowd gathered, pressure mounting on Henyard, who looked visibly uncomfortable. Despite her discomfort, she hesitated to walk away. Then, in an impulsive and reckless move, she stepped forward, getting inches away from the former treasurer's face. In a low, threatening whisper, she muttered something, but Henyard had underestimated the power of live streaming. The former treasurer smirked, turned directly to the cameras, and declared, "You heard that right. She just threatened me again," and with that, social media exploded. The hashtag began trending within seconds, and the world watched as Henyard's political career unraveled before their very eyes. The power dynamic had shifted. It was no longer Henyard dictating the narrative. Now, the truth was out, and the people of Dalton were demanding answers. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Henyard's hearing continued without her. Gone were the secret backdoor deals, and of course, the infamous recordings that had been hidden for so long. Without Mayor Tiffany Henyard there to control the narrative, the prosecution laid everything out in the open, unraveling the empire she had so carefully built. The evidence was overwhelming, revealing a staggering $30 million in financial discrepancies. The room reacted with shock and disbelief as the truth behind Henyard's corruption became undeniable, and so, the people of Dalton had their moment. They had watched this drama unfold for so long, and now, finally, the woman who had deceived them for so long was exposed. Henyard's manipulations, lies, and deceit were now undeniable. The prosecution had been unrelenting. "Your Honor, we have uncovered a series of financial transactions totaling over $30 million, the lead attorney said, his voice steady but laden with the weight of the revelations. The room fell into stunned silence as the audience absorbed the enormity of the numbers. This wasn't a case of simple mismanagement or financial missteps. It was full-blown embezzlement. The prosecution clicked through a series of records, sending shockwaves through the room. There were shell companies, fake invoices, and mysterious consulting fees, all pointing directly to Henyard and her closest allies. The The most damning piece of evidence came next. Some of those transactions weren't even linked to Dalton. They connected to luxury properties in other states. Properties that should have been invested in Dalton's infrastructure, safety, and public programs, but had instead been funneled into high-end real estate. Elsewhere, the courtroom buzzed with one question: who owned those properties? The answer came, and it was devastating. Henyard's inner circle, her closest advisors, had been implicated, and allegedly, her boyfriend had ties to some of those properties. The same boyfriend who had been conspicuously absent from a courtroom that day as the prosecution laid out the undeniable web of corruption. Henyard's fate became clear. There was no more room for doubt. This wasn't political mismanagement or a series of unfortunate mistakes. It was criminal behavior, intentional and malicious, and Henyard wasn't even present to defend herself. The judge, her voice booming with authority, made a monumental announcement. It is within the court's power to authorize an official criminal investigation into Mayor Henyard's financial dealings. The room fell into silence as the magnitude of the moment settled in. An official criminal investigation was now underway, one that could lead to federal charges. For the residents of Dalton, who had long whispered about Henyard's misdeeds, this was a moment of justice. What had once been mere gossip and rumors was now a concrete case, a full-fledged investigation with potential for serious consequences. Henry's days in power were numbered as the news broke. A crowd of Dalton residents gathered outside the courthouse. Their frustration, which had built over the years, finally found release when they heard the verdict. They erupted into cheers. "Lock her up. We finally got her," the crowd chanted, their voices rising in a wave of triumphant energy. The atmosphere was electric, but Henyard, still caught in a media frenzy just a few blocks away, had no idea what was unfolding inside the courthouse. She believed she could still spin the situation, play the victim, and twist the narrative in her favor. But what she didn't realize was that her empire was already crumbling as the cheers outside grew louder. The reality of her situation began to sink in. For years, Henyard had ruled Dalton with an iron fist. She had silenced critics, bullied whistleblowers, and manipulated the system with ruthless efficiency. But now, for the first time, the system was fighting back inside the car. Henyard's phone rang. It was one of her closest advisors. She hesitated before answering. "What?" she snapped. A frantic voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Madam Mayor, it's bad. Real bad." Henyard clenched her jaw, bracing herself. How about a moment of silence passed, and then the words tumbled out, sealing her fate. "The investigation, it's federal. They're coming after you." Her heart skipped a beat. Federal charges. That wasn't just another political scandal. This was a full-blown criminal case, and there would be no escaping it. Henyard exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the weight of what was happening began to crush her. For the first time in her career, she had nowhere to run, no narrative to spin, and no victory card to play. The power she had wielded with such ruthless precision was slipping through her fingers. Calls and messages kept coming, but Henyard had already lost control. The leaks, the tapes, the mounting evidence. It was all too much. The life she had carefully constructed, built on a foundation of corruption, intimidation, and deceit, was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Inside the courthouse, the judge's decision was final. The criminal investigation was authorized. The truth had finally been confirmed, and no amount of political maneuvering could save Tiffany Henyard now. The people of Dalton, once silenced by her iron grip on power, were seeing justice served as the courthouse erupted into celebration. The chants of the crowd outside, demanding her imprisonment, grew louder as Henyard sat in her car, the weight of her past actions bearing down on her. Her phone buzzed incessantly, but she didn't answer. The reality of her situation was sinking in. Federal charges were coming, and she was no longer the untouchable political force she once believed herself to be. Her empire had crumbled. The truth had come for her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Tiffany Henyard had once been the most powerful, feared, and untouchable leader Dalton had ever known. A political force who had manipulated, bullied, and deceived her way to the top, ruling the city with an iron fist for years. She had escaped the consequences of her actions for so long, spinning narratives, intimidating critics, and silencing anyone who dared to speak out. But now, in an instant, everything had changed. She sat alone in her car, chaos unfolding around her. The cheers of the crowd outside grew louder, a stark contrast to the panic rising in her chest. Tiffany Henyard was no longer a powerful mayor. She was a fugitive from justice. Her grip on power had evaporated, and the world was watching her unravel. For the first time in her life, Tiffany Henyard felt completely isolated. The police officers who had once been her personal security detail were now law enforcement officials, waiting for their orders to take action. Her loyal staff, those who had once done her bidding without question, had scattered, leaving her with no support. Even her lawyer, who had been by her side through every scandal, avoided eye contact, deepening her sense of abandonment. And the man who had been with her through every crisis, the man who had once been her biggest ally, was nowhere to be found. The same boyfriend who stood by her side in the face of controversy was now absent. Tiffany had burned too many bridges. And now, in her moment of greatest need, she stood alone. Panic gripped her heart and tightened its hold. She had always been able to talk her way out of tight situations, manipulate the narrative, and escape the consequences. But this time it was different. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her hand, a reminder of how quickly her world had spiraled into chaos. She stared at the screen but couldn't bring herself to answer. She already knew the truth. They're coming after everything, she muttered to herself. Everything. Her administration's finances, her transactions, her hidden accounts, the luxury properties she owned in other states, were all under scrutiny. Panic slammed into her with full force as the weight of the situation became unbearable. She glanced around for an escape, but there was no one to help her for the first time in her political career. Tiffany Henyard was completely alone. The consequences of her actions were no longer just a matter of public opinion. They were real, and they were coming for her across town. News channels were covering the unfolding chaos in real time. The headline screamed, "Bombshell, Henyard under criminal investigation. Full financial probe into corruption scandal explodes." The situation was unbearable, but then came the shock that Tiffany Henyard couldn't have anticipated. A whistleblower from her own office stepped forward with devastating evidence. "I worked in that office for years," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I saw how the money moved, how taxpayer dollars were funneled into private accounts. And when I tried to speak up, I was threatened." The interviewer leaned in, wide-eyed with disbelief. "Threatened by who?" Without hesitation, the woman replied. "By Tiffany." Henyard herself. Gasps erupted from the audience. The interviewer's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're saying Mayor Henyard directly threatened you?" The whistleblower confirmed, her voice growing steady with resolve. "Not just me. Anyone who got in her way." The camera zoomed in on the whistleblower as she pulled out a small black recorder from her purse. "I have proof," she said. The newsroom fell silent. The evidence was undeniable. Tiffany Henyard, the woman who had spent years using intimidation and fear to silence her critics, was now facing the consequences of her actions. The very people she had bullied and threatened were fighting back, armed with the proof needed to take her down back inside the courthouse. The prosecution wasted no time. The moment of reckoning had arrived for Tiffany Henyard as the courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief when a request for a full investigation into her financial dealings was granted. The weight of the situation bore down on her as she stood at the center of it all, once untouchable and above the law, now facing the full force of law enforcement and federal authorities poised to investigate her every move. Her reign, built on manipulation and fear, was crumbling outside the courthouse. The crowd had gathered in full force, their cheers loud and triumphant as news of her impending downfall spread like wildfire through Dalton, igniting both anger and celebration. "Lock her up," they chanted, holding up signs that demanded accountability. Their voices rising in unison as protesters twisted Henyard's campaign slogan into a brutal commentary on her years of corruption. The energy was electric as the people of Dalton celebrated what they had longed for, a chance at justice. Just as Henyard thought things couldn't get worse, they did. The first arrest warrant was issued, not for her, but for someone very close to her. Her top financial advisor. Reporters scrambled to confirm the breaking news, and sources revealed that authorities had issued the warrant for this high-ranking member of Henyard's administration. Then came the real shock. The FBI was now involved. The investigation had gone federal. Panic gripped Tiffany as she turned to her lawyer, her voice tight with desperation. "Fix this," she demanded, but instead of responding with the usual confidence, her lawyer gave her a look that spoke volumes. It said, "Even I can't save you now." At that moment, Tiffany Henyard fully grasped the gravity of her situation. She was no longer in control. The days of dodging accountability, brushing off accusations with a smile, and intimidating critics into silence were over. Her political empire, built on shady deals and corruption, was unraveling. The people of Dalton, who had suffered under her rule for so long, were no longer passive observers. They were celebrating outside her car. The growing crowd chanted and cheered for justice, reveling in her downfall. Tiffany, frozen in her car, watched her world crumble. This wasn't just another PR nightmare. It was the end. The people she had deceived and manipulated for years were finally seeing justice serve. Henyard had used her position for her gain, disregarding the very people she was meant to serve. But now the reckoning had come, and there was no escape as the investigation deepened. The next question on everyone's mind was whether this was just the beginning. The financial probe was still unfolding, and with the FBI now involved, the scope of the investigation had expanded. Authorities were closing in on her every move, and more arrests seemed inevitable. People close to Henyard were already flipping, providing key information that made her situation even worse. The question now was whether Tiffany Henyard would try to cut a deal to save herself, or make one last desperate attempt to escape before the hammer truly dropped. Time was running out, and her options were quickly dwindling. The people of Dalton, who had been deceived and manipulated for years, watched with growing anticipation. This was not just another political scandal. It was a long-awaited reckoning they had been waiting for. Would Henyard face the consequences of her actions, or would she attempt a final escape? The clock was ticking, and Tiffany Henyard could no longer hide behind a web of lies and manipulation that had once protected her. The truth had come for her, and this time there was no escaping.